Concord, which is Sony's latest hero shooter live service, not free-to-play game, is a way bigger disaster than I think most people are talking about, and not everybody is really zeroing in on the bigger problems with this. Because I've seen a lot of people talking about how much of a flop it is, and how it doesn't have any player numbers on Steam, and anecdotally from how difficult it is to find matches with crossplay on, doesn't seem to be doing very well in open beta on PlayStation either. But really, the scale of this flop and the reasons for it are way bigger than you think. Sony is arguably, depending on who you ask, the biggest company in video games right now. At least I think when it comes to players' expectations. For Sony to have purchased the studio behind Concord, Firewalk, in April of 2023 after a series of demonstrations of the game, for them to just outright buy the studio, and to release Concord as one of their big live service pushes the same year that they released Helldivers 2, another game that didn't have a lot of buzz before launch. A lot of people thought it looked mid, that it wasn't going to be very good, that it was going to be fun for a bit for some people, but it wasn't going to be a big deal. But that game obviously overcame all of that, and Concord is not doing that. And it puts it even more into context of just how big of a flop it is. Not even reaching 3,000 peak players on the free beta for a game that will then cost $40 is ridiculous. Like, we're talking some proportions that are like, this is a nightmare. And because both of these games had kind of a similar lead up to their launches, despite being very different, obviously, I think there's some comparisons here worth looking at. But as I have played more of Concord and kept thinking, how can a project this big for a company like Sony flop this hard? I just couldn't help myself to keep thinking about it and try to put into words and understand exactly what is going on here. I really want to dissect the situation with Concord because this is a massive, massive flop. So let's look at why. And so I've prepared a list with 5 different points, and the first point is marketing, and it might be the biggest reason for failure. Now I want to go back to that comparison to Helldivers 2, because that had some very negative buzz before launch. You can check out the original trailers for it, you can even see the comments still to this day, because they chose that style of showing gameplay and then having like fake voice act like they're playing the game, like, oh no, a big one just spawned, we need to get the rocket launcher, come help me, take cover, type of stuff. And that normally doesn't go over very well, but here's the interesting thing. Helldivers 2 not only overcame that negative buzz once the game came out and people played it and they started telling other people, hey, this game is really good, but what's important there is that it chose to show gameplay. Sure, it was all dramatic, but they were trying to showcase to people what the game would be like when you're playing it. But Sony and Firewalk took a different approach from the start with Concord, and that is, look at these really polished cutscenes. I think that initially some people thought that this was going to be like a campaign, that this was going to be a normal first-person shooter, and then immediately had their hopes shattered. So that's not good, but that is a very Sony move. Sony tries to associate their quality with a lot of very high production value cinematics and characters and things like that. I don't think they're always successful at it. I would actually say that their average is pretty bad on it, but that is a very Sony move. So they led with the idea that this game had story and had interesting characters, which it doesn't. And that's not a selling point that most people care about in a multiplayer exclusive game. More importantly, the problem with the marketing is that after we got an incredibly long cinematic, the next step was to have people talk about the game in what felt like the most marketing buzzwords ever. It felt like they were trying to convince us that they had done something new when everything that they were showing were the same hero shooter things we've seen elsewhere. And while they do have twists, and again, I will keep saying, I think this game, it's not perfect, I have some issues, we'll talk about them, but it's a really good game, it's a good shooter, its mechanics work, it's fundamentally very, very solid. But I think that disingenuous marketing is way worse than cringe marketing. We can smell the BS from a mile away. So when we have developers that we've grown increasingly more used to them being very honest and straightforward with us, sitting down in front of an expensive camera and being like, we really tried to combine it with elements that are similar to fighting games that add a level of depth that is unprecedented within the genre. And then they show us that you can place a bubble shield. We're like, uh-huh. Sure. So I think that's number one. So for number two, I have organic marketing not being something the game is really capable of. And admittedly, this is a bit of a chicken and the egg sort of situation, because we could argue that because nobody is interested in the game and therefore the player base is incredibly low during the beta and will be worse even at launch at $40, you know, there's not enough people playing for cool stuff to happen and then clips of it to be shared or for people to be streaming it and things like that. So that's one possibility, but I do want to argue that the game just isn't designed for those sorts of things. Despite the fact that now after playing more, I understand that Concord wants to be a round-based shooter, but with Overwatch abilities and the general movement and handling of something like Destiny 2 PvP, it just doesn't have things in place for crazy clutch plays. At least not in ways that can happen very normally. Like, unless you're hitting a ton of headshots with the sniper, and even then, if you're up against a tank and a healer, you probably can't 2v1. It doesn't have that element of Counter-Strike or Valorant of somebody just hitting 5 headshots and clutching out a round. It also doesn't have ultimates like in Overwatch to have these big bombastic moments that are very clip-friendly, that are very hype from a spectator's point of view of like, wow, crazy thing happened that was really exciting and turned the tide of a match in a way that's really flashy and intuitive to understand even if you see nothing about the game, to immediately get you interested in it. It just doesn't have things that are kind of share-worthy. Pretty much any other shooter that I can think of has moments that happen constantly, practically on a per-match basis, that are more immediately hype and shareable than what happens in Concord. That's not to say that there's not plenty of hype things in Concord that can happen. It's just that they're not as frequent and they're not as hype. Which is point number 3. That it is in an incredibly crowded genre, another thing that Helldivers 2 didn't have to deal with. And while its quality is exceptionally high, I think that we are now entering a period, especially with a lot of the competition of the free-to-play space, where being really good, even excellent, is not good enough. You can't just be excellent if you want a piece of the live service pie that everybody really, really wants. You need to be special. You need to have something that nobody else has that immediately makes people want to play your game. And Concord does not have it. Gameplay-wise, it feels like such a mishmash of different things that even when it feels good, even when you have great matches, and I've had really good matches. I had a couple of matches that were like perfectly balanced. Like we had a tank, we had a healer, we had something like a skirmisher, we had a flanker, both teams. It was super dynamic, super fun. It felt organized. We were playing the objective. We were coordinating instinctively all of the abilities. It was all great. But even then, it wasn't as good as playing Overwatch 2, which is a game that everybody hates, right? So, like, that's not good. It wasn't as hype as a Final Circle in Apex. I'm sure it wasn't as hype as many rounds that people have in Valorant, because I refuse to play that game, but, you know, I'll take their word for it. It was fun, but, like, in a kind of Call of Duty-esque way that didn't really, like, excite me in the same way. It didn't get my heart racing to the same degree as many other games. So even though I was like, this is really well made and this is really fun, that competition level is a whole different story now. You have to be way, way above what you think you have to be. Even when you come in with a studio filled with people who are experts, who have tons of experience, there's an it factor and a creativity necessary at the core of a game that's going to compete in a genre this crowded that Concord doesn't have. Speaking of incredibly competitive and high standards, YouTube has those things as well. So if you think this video is pretty good so far, maybe think about hitting the like button. It can be now, it can be at the end of the video. Anyways, let's keep going. Number 4 is, I think that the fundamental design of a lot of what's going on here is just bad, starting with characters. After putting in way more time than I should have into Concord, and it's not because I regret that time, it's because most of it was spent looking for good matches and not getting them. But you know, you get a good one every hour, you're like, well, maybe the next one. No. And again, I'll repeat it, even those good matches, not as good as the good matches in other games, but you know, this is what I do. I check out games and think about them. You get used to the character silhouettes, you get used to the abilities, but I still couldn't tell you anything about the personality of these characters. They have these really throwaway quips. I don't really understand them. I don't know if they have interesting relationships between them. There's just so much that doesn't work that it makes you appreciate a lot of other things in other games. When it comes to their design, aesthetically, that's very subjective, but I think that they don't come close to anything from Valorant to Overwatch to Apex. But what's interesting there from games that I have several hundred hours in, I now appreciate that there's moments in things like Apex as a battle royale where you're just calmly looting with a team and you get to hear the characters interact and showcase their personality, and slowly over time you get to know them. In Overwatch, not only are they incredibly expressive and really well designed overall, but those little moments before a round starts where they talk to each other and they quip, and the voice lines and things like that really flesh them out and get people attached to them. And because in Concord the match just starts after the very long loading screen, you just go and they say just the most basic stuff. If you need healing, come to me. Wow. Exciting. I really know what makes this character tick. I understand their motivation. And they're supposed to be fleshing that out with the cutscenes, but I'm just saying that isn't that moving backwards in a sense? This is a multiplayer game. Most people are going to spend their time playing the multiplayer of the game. Isn't trying to incorporate as much of their personality and their relationships amongst them into the multiplayer the smarter decision than to bundle it all up into the separate thing of the story? A lot of people are gonna skip the story. You have to know that. What are you, new? And while there's these other games that find ways in their design to incorporate that and get people attached to the characters, which then, you know, sells skins or makes people want to play more, or creates a fandom and cosplayers and whatever you want. Here, they're banking on people will just find the characters interesting enough to want to watch cutscenes that you could just watch on YouTube to get to know the characters. I don't understand this. Like, people were immediately interested in the characters from Overwatch because it was just spectacularly well done. It's something that we hadn't seen before, and it was eye-catching and ear-catching right from the start. But Overwatch didn't just have incredibly successful cinematics outside of the game, they put all of that personality into every moment when you're playing the game. And Concord doesn't do that. So the characters are just boring. If there's something worse than being bad, it's being forgettable. And I do want to defend some of the designs of these characters. I think that the balance is absolutely terrible. There are characters here that just by the virtue of good positioning can destroy you immediately, while other characters need to put in an ungodly amount of effort and land like 20 headshots to get a decent TTK, while others can press mouse button, one key and be like boop and you're disappeared. But some of the designs of these characters are actually really cool. I really like Haymar, which is the floating woman that shoots fire and has the charge up crossbow. There's something about the movement. If you try and explore the movement in the game, there's something really cool about taking advantage of momentum and using her glide around corners while charging the crossbow, and then, you know, fires here and flashbang there. There's some cool designs here. There's some cool little twists, but that's not enough because I feel more attached to other characters that are less cool to play as, but their personality or how they fit into an intuitive balance of the game more. Which, speaking of which, there's just a lot of weird stuff within how they try and do the mishmashes. I spoke in my previous video of the deck system instead of having an econ during the rounds and things like that. That is weird. But there's other weird decisions. It's really weird that this game incorporates counter-strafing, which is basically, if you've played Counter-Strike or Valorant, it's the idea that when you're standing still is when you have accuracy. So if you're moving right and you tap left, you go in the opposite direction, kind of like a car stopping momentum, to faster reach a standstill point. And you do the same thing in Concord, but there is no aiming penalty for moving. It's just that the character has this weighty momentum to them, but it's also very arcadey, so it's immediately using this as a very poor communication towards the player that you need to be moving, but you can't strafe from side to side to avoid shooting, which might also be like a very console design ethos, I guess. So what it wants you to do is to consistently be sliding and double jumping to continue your movement through momentum instead of canceling it through strafing and using the dodge on characters that can dodge in the opposite direction that they're moving as the strafe. But that's not intuitive, and that's not explained to people. And it's another example of just how it goes like half and half through ideas that kind of don't really work together because they're taking stuff from every other shooter. But anyways, number 5. I think that it can't be underestimated because I think I underestimated this. I think there's a ton of people that aren't even playing the beta because they know that if they were to like it for some reason, it's going to cost them $40. So I've talked at length in this live service world how companies keep believing, they keep dreaming that there's people that have enough time to have multiple live service games. Because otherwise, how are you going to capture people for your live service game? Let's think about that for a minute. Who are you trying to get to play Concord nightly or weekly? Because potentially what they could be thinking is we're going to poach people from the live services that they already play. There must be enough people that are unhappy with their current routine of Apex or Counter-Strike or Valorant or Overwatch or whatever, or Siege or whatever it might be, that we can poach. And we have enough elements of all of those things that for some reason, they're all going to gravitate to this game and just throw away all of the time they spent on those. The other option is that they believe that there's a large segment of people who are interested in getting into a live service shooter, especially now that we all know what that means. We all know the commitment required for those things. And instead of going for one of the very well-established ones that you can trust will probably not shut down and that have been well explored and have a wealth of content creators and things around them, you want to try something completely new that also has a price tag up front and microtransactions afterwards. And I just think that this is the dumbest idea possible. And because that exists, even the people who might have been swayed to include this in their weekly game rotation with their friends, or to move away from whatever game they're currently putting in an hour or two every night into, they won't even try the beta because they know that if they like it, they're going to have to pay $40. So why do that? So at the end, you have a marketing that was unappealing, a communication that didn't make it clear what the game is, and to be honest, even if you play it for a long while, you still kind of don't get what it is. A game that's not designed to be easily viral and shareable. Characters that in their design and in the design of the game are not meant to be unique and interesting and easy for players to get to know and get attached to, and instead a step backwards in trying to give that exposition through a dedicated cutscene mode as a big selling point, all while being in an incredibly competitive genre where they don't have anything that really stands out locked behind a price tag. If there is a reason why Concord is a huge disaster that Sony and pretty much everybody else trying to get into the live service game that everybody is chasing, they need to learn the lessons here. Because the part about this entire thing that makes me sad is that there is a group of developers, and I don't know if it's their fault, if they made these terrible calls. I don't know how much direction was given from focus groups, because this game does feel a bit like it was made in a focus group tube. I don't know how much of it is Sony trying to establish their new plan and selling their games for $40, their live services, then with the support on top of that. I don't know how much is the fault of the developers. I just know that a lot of the people who worked on this game, especially on the technical side of making a game that plays well, that looks pretty good, and that feels good to play, their work is very good and is going to complete waste. And I don't like when that happens. That's really sad to see some of the probably best talent in the industry have the financial backing necessary to do something really cool, and they made this. That's really sad. And the reasons for it, be that focus groups, or be that Sony's crazy plans, or be that they had some really, really bad creative ideas at the studio, it's still a shame. A huge shame. But I guess this is a video of me trying to explain to myself, and hopefully I am at least right enough to have some lessons to share, some interesting ideas here, of why Concord is the incredibly, unfathomable flop that it is, given its context. Anyways, I've been Mug Thief. Thank you so much for watching. I promise I won't talk more about Concord. There's some Elden Ring stuff coming soon, and a whole lot of really, really interesting stuff as well, including maybe another hero shooter that I'm actually excited for. So, thank you for watching. An extra special thanks to my patrons up on the $1 patron wall. It's called that way because there's only one tier, $1. Remember to hit the like button if you enjoyed it. Remember to subscribe if you want more of my opinions, my news, reviews, and long-form essays. At least check out the channel, and then consider subscribing. And as always, I'll see you again very soon.